Thank you. There's a recent comment about, let me ask, how many people here are in philosophy departments or do philosophy? A few. Okay, so you'll know that there have been some scandals recently. And so there's a lot of discussion about this. And someone in another blog said, well, we owe a lot to our courageous colleagues on feminist philosophers for bringing some of this out. And I wrote in response, I love the idea of being courageous, but I'm really just very pissed off. And one thing I've learned is that trying to be honest and move forward at least gives you a self that you can largely count on. Okay, I am so delighted to be here. I think that from my perspective, and Fausto-Sterling has, among the many, many things she's done, has really focused on a concept, a kind of distinction, and to some extent, Ginger and I agree about, and we're going to be talking about somewhat the same thing, though my perspective is a bit different. And I'm immensely grateful to it. Now, on the plane, I was reading some other for work, and I thought, oh God, I feel so outclassed. Maybe I just won't do this. Okay, so let me start with the outline. I'm going to talk about Anne Fausto-Sterling's, one of the problems she sees with the sex-gender distinction. And I'm going to be looking at material to some extent that's from Sex in the Body. And what I want to ask is whether the problem, which I haven't really described yet, that she sees transfers over to cognitive neuroscience. And my answer is going to be yes. And I'm going to mention briefly two kinds of cognitive neuroscience, both of which are amazingly asocial. And then I wanted to ask, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with the cognitive science that draws an inter-outer distinction? I mean, how could cognitive science not draw an inter-outer distinction? Well, I think that's very problematic. So I'm going to question it, and I'm going to question it starting with an anecdote from Semir Zeki, whom some of people here, anybody who's he's a London neuroscientist, really done stunning work on distinguishing on the perception of motion, but he's also done wonderful work on art. And he was visiting us in Houston, visiting my group in Houston. And what I'm going to say is that what we see is there's a notion of flourishing that runs through a lot of general concepts that people use to talk about cognitive neuroscience. And that when we get this issue, first of all, it's a notion that relates some of the very basic terms like vision, thinking, to a social world. But secondly, it's a very problematic notion. I don't think it's really been drawn out. It hasn't been analyzed, and it's capable of causing enormous amount of harm of a sort that Anne Fausto-Sterling recently talked about in a different kind of case in the Boston Record. So that's the plan. As Anne Fausto-Sterling has noted, this divide between sex and gender can be taken to give us this division. First of all, we have on the one side the body, which is supposed to be the domain of nature and science, and on the other side, culture and nurture and stuff like that. And the charge that one can make against this is that it gets us into a lot of trouble by, among other things, saying that the body can be successfully and completely studied independently of culture. What we do is artificially segment the mind, the body from the culture, rather than seeing us, to use again one of Anne's phrases, rather than seeing us as biocultural. So we want to see ourselves as biocultural entities. And as things are now, although it's getting better, and partly because of Anne's work, as things are now, one often finds oneself in a position where you've got the cultural theorists and the feminists on the one side who are increasingly getting to hate the science, and the scientists who are increasingly thinking that these people are just not worth listening to. And I wish I could remember who it was. I think it may have been something reported by Victoria Pitts-Taylor in an article in Hypatia this spring, I think, or it might have been last spring. She quotes sociologists saying, oh, you know, those cognitive neuroscientists, they're just impossible. They're getting into our territory. I mean, we do culture, right? They don't. So, okay, let me see. So what would it be like to think of the mind as the brain, where we think of the brain as really independent of anything outside it? So you can, you know, like you study a corpse, well, if you study the brain, you want one that moves around, but still, you want to look at the inside. And interestingly, there's a nice quote from a philosopher, and to some extent, I should say, I'm looking at philosophers' take on cognitive neuroscience. It provides a nice target. Right, I better hold this up closer. One sort of understanding that cognitive scientists are often interested in achieving is analogous to the understanding that one would have of a clock if one could identify each of its functional parts, and the way in which all these parts interact to bring it about that the clock has a reliable disposition. So he says, thus, at least one of the goals of cognitive science will be to explain the micro-level processes that are characteristic of the mind. These are processes in which one mental event or state is caused by another mental event or state that precedes it as closely as possible. So here's the idea: studying the mind is studying these causal chains inside the body. And you might not want to think they're causal chains. You might have a network or something like that, which is not exactly causal chains, but it's studying the activity that's inside the brain. Now, there is something sort of staggeringly odd about this example. No amount of looking at the internal mechanisms of a clock will tell you that the clock does tell correct time. I mean, this is a project that cannot be carried out. If you buy a clock in San Francisco and bring it here, then it has to be recalibrated, right? And there's some important things. Clocks have to be calibrated, and possibly minds have to be calibrated with the world, but clocks certainly clearly have to be calibrated with the world. And secondly, there's a lot of slack in what we might seek about the kind of calibration in a clock. One thing, we might want a clock that always tells the correct time. Keep it in one place, but we want it in that one place to always tell the correct time. As far as I can see, there aren't many clocks made that way. At least every clock in my house has a different take on what time it is. And every once in a while we go around and try to get them. But it's obviously been much cheaper to build clocks that aren't consistently well calibrated. And part of the reason is because, you know, we don't have the sort of batteries that's going to keep the clock from slowing down. We don't have, especially, well, actually, the Northeast has had a terrible time, but we're coming up to hurricane season. And so, you know, we don't have many clocks. The clocks that run on batteries are going to have problems, but the clocks that don't run on batteries are going to have other kinds of problems as trees fall on wires and things like that. So there's a lot of recalibration. And some of the considerations are really considerations that you might say get brought to bear in evolution. We may be, I mean, you know, philosophers like to think that we are really well calibrated and that we really, really can get things absolutely and precisely right. But many people working on cognitive neuroscience and evolution have argued that, in fact, what evolution has decided is that a lot of our sensory mechanisms are good for getting us the gist of things that serve, for example, to find food, to fend ourselves, get mates, and things like that, but that they aren't giving us the kind of full worldview that only philosophers but ordinary people think that we have. So let me mention, this will be familiar to you, that actually there are two versions of cognitive neuroscience. There are the Cartesians, which is what Wedgwood is, and the Cartesians think it's all in the head. But there's another, right, the embodied and activist theorists. And here the essential part of cognition includes other body parts and activities, and even some parts of the environment. But with the exception of a very few people, for example, Michel Merritt is one of them, and Sue Campbell, who tragically died, is another one of them. These theories are remarkably asocial, right? So, for example, there's actually now a fairly extended literature on whether your iPhone could have your memories in it. But there isn't much of a literature on whether other people have your memories or whether other people provide part of your memories, which is a thesis that Sue Campbell had. And you've heard about Michel Merritt. Right, so there's a nexus of problems here, and this actually is where my research is, and I wanted to mention that because I realize this is an interdisciplinary audience, and I've worried that people are saying, God, she's talking about cognitive neuroscience and vision and things. Never heard about any of this stuff. And I am a world-class expert in the field. What's going on here? Well, I'm looking at a conjunction of problems, and they impact the cognitive neuroscience literature a lot, and they are philosophy's articulation of them, and they impact feminist theories a lot also. And I think that the notion of mental representation, which is what my book, Keeping the World in Mind, is really about, has been a very important and problematic part of this, because if you think there are mental representations, and obviously people like Wedgwood and Chris Post, famously Jerry Fodor, think that there are these mental representations and they're in your head, then you really do have a very strong inside-outside problem. If you think that instead some of the mind is extended, then you might be like Clark, who still believes in mental representations, but they're mental representations all around. And what I've been arguing is that these mental representations have, among other things, a huge problem. Nobody has explained how they've been able to cause things. That's a huge problem, and a couple of people have noticed this. But another huge problem is the mental representations that philosophers discuss are not the mental representations that show up in cognitive neuroscience, and I really argue that with tons of examples in Keeping the World in Mind. So that sort of locates what I'm saying, and I'm having trouble with this small screen. I think actually it's, my glasses are, no, that's not going to make it better. So there's a huge gap. What's wrong? So let's look at what's wrong with the picture of a theory of mind that doesn't have the social in it. Okay. I think I'm not going to go on that page looking at the time. I'm going to get started with this. Samir Zeki and I were talking one day, and I mentioned that we had a candidate for a job who was talking about confirmation hypotheses, and the candidate was maintaining that the more instances of a hypothesis you got, the better confirmed it was. And that seemed to me really strange. One community I know I quite closely connected to is the superconductivity community at the Texas Center for Superconductivity at the University of Houston, where Paul Chu, discoverer of high-temperature superconductivity, is. Oh, thank you. That's fabulous. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Zeki was, so I said I didn't think you know, this, people who are looking for superconducting material don't say, oh God, we made this material and it's superconducted today, and then we'll make some more tomorrow, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and maybe, oh, you know, if you get all sorts of people, you get 50 examples, and then it'll get more confirmed if we get 100 examples. And they don't work that way, because if you know the chemical essence, in effect, you don't need to get lots of other things. with that same essence to see if it does the same thing. The challenge is rather whether you really did get a thing with that essence, and so whether the experiment, your original experiment, is repeatable. So Samir, agreeing with me, said, and I'm not sure what his number was, but it might have been 11. Give me 11 kidneys and I can tell you what a kidney is. And I think that's just wrong, right? Because you could have excised, decaying, malfunctioning kidneys, and they might not enable him to tell that the kidneys remove waste from the blood. Right? What something is will often be characterized in terms of what it does when it's functioning well. And, oops, that's the next slide. And if you want to check that out, you could do as I did with Google. So you think, oh God, that's like a philosopher looking at that first sentence. You know, do you really know that's true? So I started to enter terms into Google and see how they were defined. And yeah, that's how we often approach things. We talk about what a heart is in terms of what it does when it's functioning well. I mean, clearly there are hearts around that aren't pumping, or that are pumping very badly. And when we talk about thumbs, one thing that's really important about a thumb is that it opposes these and that it moves in a very different way. So I am going to the next slide. So what we've got is the idea that I think extends over a lot of the terms in cognitive neuroscience. What we want to understand about vision is what vision is when it functions well. Philosophers are very interested in what is vision. So for example, we would like to know, and sometimes argue about, if you see somebody's shadow, are you seeing the person? This is not an issue in cognitive neuroscience, right? Because what cognitive neuroscience is interested in investigating are what are the mechanisms for seeing well, and what is going wrong with those mechanisms when people don't see well. So what is this seeing well? Or again, remembering well, having a good memory or a bad memory? Reed Montague has this interesting quote from 1999. It's interesting that, well, actually I'm not going to make a nasty comment about philosophy. It's interesting. Reed says, if you look at the heavy stuff, structures are constructed by evolution. So most creatures are tightly woven into particular environmental and social niches and are the answers to manifold questions posed by their environs. This is a very radical, different picture from the one that Wedgwood was posing. It's not about what computations you're performing in your head or what chains, causal chains are going on inside your head. It's rather how you're interacting with the environment, whether you're interacting well in order to support goals like nutrition, reproduction, survival. So if we want to know what functioning well is, should we understand it in terms of something like evolution? Maybe what functioning well is for something to have features that were selected by evolution. And I think that's not going to work. Right, because we've had this notion of functioning well since Aristotle, and there have been different emphases. I mean, Aristotle just thought things had a kind of telos, and which gets repeated into the Middle Ages. But a lot of people haven't taken that kind of picture. And with medicine, for example, medicine doesn't have to believe that, but medicine for 200 or 300 years has certainly had a notion of functioning well. And so trying to treat things that aren't functioning well. So I think what we have here is a very unanalyzed quasi-medical notion of working well, and that it's endemic in the sciences of the mind. And it's a notion that links what I think is I don't think there are these mental representations in the brain. That's a very Wittgensteinian view, right? I think that mental representations arise from kinds of social interactions when you're functioning well. Now, I'm just going to close with a comment about functioning well because we need, I think, to think about it really very carefully for give you the flipped the flip picture. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. As soon as we leave, I'll mention it because you've seen it. This is a picture we don't know that one picture is a flip of the other picture. If the shadows at the bottom, we see it as bending out. If the shadows at the top, we see it as coming in. And we don't know whether that is because in human life, light almost always comes from above, or whether it's something that's carried in the genes in some way. We just don't know. But it is a universal feature. Okay. So, last real slide. As soon as we leave simple, this is why functioning well really needs to be looked at. As soon as we leave relatively simple mental sensory mechanisms, we are in dire danger of accepting a tyranny of the normal. And Fausto-Sterling, in the Boston Review for April 7th, 2014, talks about this, letting go of normal. Turns out that some kids, that sleeping on the back may give you delayed motion as an infant, right? So you have abnormal, I mean, they don't die, but they're slower than the others. So a skilled behavior required by a culture can be used as a basis for a deep evaluation of the person. They're not functioning well. That's really bad. And the latest that I know about came into existence in January 2014, because this is the first big article about it in a serious scientific journal. And this is the sluggish cognitive tempo, right? And this is so they're investigating the possibility of medicating children who are daydreaming, and they spend their time daydreaming and they're not thinking quickly, they're not really very engaged. Now, I mean, seems to me so dangerous. So if you look at the history if you look at writings on what gifted children are like, right, some of them have wonderful background support and they're focused and they just excel all the way through, but other equally gifted children have very adverse experiences and they opt out. And they spend their time daydreaming, among other things. I remember when I was in the 4th grade, my father's a military officer, and we went from coast to coast. And in the 4th grade, I decided that nothing adults said could be believed anymore. Right? And so I was labeled retarded, of course. Right? So what do we do about this? One of the things I loved about Anne's work is that, you know, a lot of us, if we get involved in this nature-nurture arguments, at least the philosophical versions of it, people say, oh, well, what we do is we discover the flaws in the nature arguments, we discover the flaws in the nurture arguments. But Anne has said, look, we've got to look beyond this and think about things from a very different perspective, and that's her dynamical systems and her notion of looping. And I think that's just an extremely valuable thing to do, and we need to do that to get a grip, I think, on what in the world we're doing with this covertly evaluative notion that's present in the sciences of the minds and that's being used on, among other things, children. So that's it. The end.
Questions?
Oh, sure. Yes.
Okay. We do have some time. Questions?
You said that mental states, as envisioned by Fausto or somebody like that, don't have any explanatory power. They don't explain how one event causes another event. How does your description of a more general mental representation, one that includes social norms, one that is extended in the language of the prior speaker, have any, explain anything causally? And are you guys really talking about the same thing, or just talking differently about the same thing, talking about the same thing differently?
Good. That's a great question. Let me just step back for a minute on this. What we've come to realize is something of a historical fact, and you'll see this discussed by, Maschery in his recent book on concepts. So when philosophers got busy with mental representations, thanks to Jerry Fodor, which happened in the mid-70s. You look at the philosophical literature, there's a little discussion of mental representations, and then in 1975 it explodes, and this is really a lot of Fodor's interest. And Fodor said, look, a theory of mental representation should be a theory of the content of your thought. And so some people came along and he said, oh, well, you haven't thought with this content because you have these dispositions. And he really brought some telling objections to it. And so what most philosophical discussions of concepts has been concepts that tell you what the content of your thought is. And we have a big proliferation of these accounts of what the content of your thoughts is. But as Maschery points out, psychologists and neuroscientists and all these people are not so much interested in whether you're thinking about cats or rats. They're interested in how you're operating with whatever you have. And on that, the philosophical theories are largely just silent. Just silent. Now, what I wanted to say is that concepts come from a public language and social interaction and stuff like that. And that when neuroscientists talk about concepts talk about mental representations as in the brain, what they're using, interestingly enough, I think, is a different and very much older notion that comes in with Aristotle. And they think of the neural patterns as in some way reflecting, mirroring the patterns in the world. And so the idea is that we get this nice correlation. But there's no problem with how do neural patterns cause motion. I mean, God, that's what they do, I mean, you get this and it goes on to this part of the brain. And so mental representations in neuroscience are entirely unproblematic. Mental representations as understood by philosophy, we don't know. I mean, nobody's really come up with a good account. And every once in a while, people come up and say, it's like seeing somebody say, the emperor has no clothes. And I mean, when I had horrible times with publishers over keeping the world in mind. And the only way I got it published was these nice people who were dying to get neurofeminism because this is really going to sell. And I said, okay, you can have neurofeminism, but then you've got to publish this other book of mine.
Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you.